Niko, Kolodny, and John MacFarlane have developed an interesting paradox of deontic logic. It's called the miner's paradox. You're a decision maker, and you have to figure out what to do. The situation is this: 10 coal miners are trapped inside a mine shaft. Now there are two shafts that are part of this mine. Let's call them A and B. The miners are trapped, and the collapse that has led to them being trapped has actually broken a water main, so water is flooding into the mine. Now, the problem is this: you don't know which shaft the miners are in. You have no idea whether they're in A or in B. And it makes a difference, because you have the ability to block one of those shafts and to keep the water from flowing into it. But you can't block both. And so the difficulty is this: if you block shaft A, let's say, and the miners are there, then you've saved them all. You've saved 10 lives. But what if they're not there? What if they're in B? Well, the water, by blocking A, you're shifting it all into shaft B. And so if they're in B, you're going to kill all 10. So if you choose to block shaft A, you're taking a huge risk. You might save everyone, but you might also kill everyone. You have no idea which shaft they're in, you have no information, so basically it's a 50-50 chance. Well, of course, it's exactly the same with shaft B. If you block B, you can keep the water from flooding into B. That will save anyone in B. So if they're in B, you're golden. You've saved all those lives. However, if they're in A, that water is going to flood into A and you will kill those 10 miners. Now, what happens if you don't block either shaft? Well, water is going to flood into both, but they're going to be able to scramble into a position where most of them are out of the water. However, one miner is going to die. And so you've got 3 options. You can block shaft A. If you do, you've got a 50-50 chance of saving all the miners. But if you don't save them, you're going to kill all of them. Your second option is to block shaft B. Well, if they're in B, again, you've saved all of them. If they're in A, you've killed all of them. So 50-50 chance. Your last option is to block neither shaft. One is going to die. So what should you do? Now, intuitively, you might say, look, ideally, I'd like to wait for more information, try to figure out whether they're in A or in B. But let's say there is no way to get that information and the water is flooding in rapidly. So you've got to make a choice now. You can't wait. What should you do? Most of us would probably conclude that you should block neither shaft. Instead, you should allow one miner to die, but save 9 of the 10. However, there's a very simple argument that that's not right. And it seems like this simple argument is powerful and relies on only a couple of intuitive principles of logic, and yet it comes up with what seems to be the wrong answer. So here's the idea. The miners are either in shaft A or in shaft B. Well, if they're in A, you should block shaft A. If they're in shaft B, you should block shaft B. But they're in one or the other, so it looks like we should conclude that either you should block shaft A or you should block shaft B. And yet we had just concluded that those 2 options were incredibly risky. You've got a 50-50 chance of killing all the miners. And so intuitively, that's the wrong answer. Instead, you should probably block neither shaft. Now, what has gone wrong? If we think carefully about the logical principles involved in that argument, it's pretty straightforward. They're in either shaft A or shaft B. If they're in A, block A. If they're in B, block B. So block A or block B. All we used is modus ponens, together with a principle of disjunction exploitation. Essentially, if you've got A or B, and both of them imply some conclusion C, conclude C. Well, those are both very appealing principles of logic, so what's gone wrong? Now, we can even get away from the idea of the disjunction here by realizing that we can pursue the argument in a different way. We could say, look, they're in either A or B. If they're in A, you should block shaft A. But we've already concluded, on the basis of the general situation, that you shouldn't block either shaft. so you shouldn't block shaft A. It seems to follow that then they're not in shaft A. Well, we can apply the same reasoning to shaft B. If they're in B, you should block B, but we had agreed you shouldn't block B. So they mustn't be in B. But that's bizarre, right? We've concluded they're not in A and they're not in B. But we know that they have to be in either A or B. So that's a way of getting the paradox without really even appealing to that somewhat complicated logical rule of disjunction exploitation. In fact, we could pursue it more single-mindedly and more bizarrely maybe by saying, look, if they're in A, we should block shaft A. But we've concluded we shouldn't block shaft A, so they're not in A. So they're in A or B, they must be in B, so we should block shaft B. But of course, that's a ridiculous form of argument. It's still just a 50-50 chance of saving them. Now, if we think more generally about what's gone wrong here, we can realize that there is a distinction, and this is what Kolodny and MacFarlane stress. There is a distinction between objective and subjective senses of ought. And so if we think objectively, the principles we started with are entirely appealing. Yes, if they're in A, then objectively, here's what you should do. You should block shaft A. If they're trapped in shaft B, then, of course, objectively, you should block shaft B. The difficulty is that we're not in a position to know that. We don't know whether they're in A or in B. And so we're not in a position to take advantage of those objective facts. Instead, we have to decide on the basis of the information we have. We don't know where they are. And given that we don't know where they are, we end up concluding, well, the best thing to do, given our limited knowledge, is to block neither shaft. Now, I think if we reflect on this, we realize it's a much more general sort of problem in ethics. There are objective oughts, but subjective oughts as well. And in fact, it's something that in the utilitarian tradition there's some attention to. People have focused on this question of how to think about actions in advance in what we might call the context of deliberation, as opposed to the way we reflect on them later, thinking about the context of evaluation or justification. And so we might think of it this way. Beforehand, you have to act on the basis of the information you have. You don't know exactly what the effects of your action are going to be. The best you can do is say, what are the expected effects of my action? And so in the case of blocking shaft A, for example, we say, well, 50-50 chance. We either save all or kill all. So the expected life savings out of that is, well, 5 minors. Now, of course, in neither case are we going to save 5. Instead, we're either going to save 10 or save 0. But the expected payoff, you might say, given that it's a 50-50 shot, is 5 minors. And that's why losing 1 seems better than losing 5. We're judging this on the basis of expected outcomes given our subjective state of mind. Now, of course, if we end up blocking neither shaft, and so 1 minor dies, and then somebody comes up to us, let's say the wife of the miner who was trapped there, saying, why didn't you block shaft A? That's where they were. You could have saved my husband's life. Well, yes, we could have if we had blocked shaft A. The problem is we had no way of knowing that that was objectively the right thing to do. Now, this kind of thing happens all the time. People make decisions on the basis of the information they have. A doctor, for example, may look at a sick patient and assign the treatment that is the ordinarily prescribed treatment, the right treatment in general for that kind of patient. However, the doctor, let's say, is in no position to know that that patient has a rare complication that in fact is going to make that treatment have devastating effects. Afterward, we can say, why did you do that? Wow, that was the wrong treatment to prescribe. Well, yes, it was, objectively speaking, but the doctor had no way of knowing that. So we have to distinguish the oughts that we apply, given our state of mind subjectively before we act, from those that we might retrospectively think about and say, well, gosh, I guess you should have done this, but that's on the basis of information we didn't have before. Now, I think there's a broad general point behind this, in addition to the point that we have to distinguish the context of deliberation before the act from the context of evaluation after the act. between the subjective ought and the objective ought. And that is that, in general, moral reasoning of this kind is non-monotonic. What I mean by saying that is that additional information can change our conclusions. If we do not know which shaft the miners are in, we conclude we should block neither shaft. But if, just as we're about to give that order, we get additional information, wait a minute, we heard something, they're in shaft A. Then we know, aha, forget that, the right thing to do is to block shaft A. This is highly sensitive to the information we have. When we learn more, we change our conclusions. Now, in classical logic, getting more information can never make you discard a conclusion you had already reached. It might enable you to reach additional conclusions, but it never makes you take back a conclusion. But in ethical reasoning, it's not like that. In fact, we routinely take back conclusions. We should say, you should block neither shaft. But then finding out they're in A, we say, oh, wait a minute. Yes, you should block A. And so that's not merely just an additional conclusion. It is something that makes us take back the conclusion that you should do nothing. This is all highly information sensitive. And as we gain more information, we change our conclusions about what to do. Now, when I put it that way, it seems obvious, right? I mean, what you ought to do depends on what you're in a position to know. In the context of deliberation, we have to decide on the basis of what we know. If we learn more, we're going to change our minds about what ought to be done. It's a common sense observation. But what it tells us is that if we apply ordinary classical logic in many of these decision contexts, we're going to be led astray. In this case, you might be led to think, we gotta gamble. They're in A or B. If they're in A, we should block A. If they're in B, we should block B. So we should block A or should block B. Let's flip a coin. When in fact, the right conclusion is to block neither shaft. You've got to think carefully, not only about the information you have and what seems best on the basis of that information, but be open to changing your mind when you learn new information. And that tells us that open-mindedness in ethics is really critical. As you learn more information, your conclusions may well change in a way that they don't tend to change in some other areas like mathematics, for example, or in a lot of other contexts where classical deductive logic works just fine.